Welcome to the One More Thing podcast. Today I'm joined with Dr. Larry Baucom.
Good morning.
Good morning, man. It's a nice, brisk morning out here in Sarasota. Beautiful day.
It sure is, and we have the opportunity to chat about the weekend, and I don't know whether I should be interviewing you or you should be interviewing me. Either way, we're going to jump in and refine it a little bit or go a little deeper.
Yeah, we were on stage together, and it's always fun to be in dialogue with you because while we get up there, we have notes that kind of structure our conversation. A lot of times our wheels just get spinning and we feed off of each other, and there's some elements that emerge that aren't even in the notes, and I thought that's what makes, I think, the dialogue unique.
Yeah, someone was coming in and he said, I just saw Ed, and I asked Ed who was on stage today, whether it was Larry or Troy, and the person said, oh, it's a double whammy. So I thought that was a fun thing. And then later that person came to me and said it was a double whammy.
Yeah.
And that was very good. So thanks for being a part of that. And it was fun to talk about worship together.
That's right. And there were some interesting things that were brought up, and, you know, us dialoguing, there's a lot of things we can't get to. That's why we obviously do One More Thing. But we had talked about this idea, again, you brought up this notion of confession as being like this element that's essential for worship. And I didn't think we were able to dive into that a whole lot because of some of the other stuff we were talking about that we got caught on. But why do you think confession is like sort of the initiation of worship? What does confession sort of allow us how does confession allow us to experience worship?
Well, I think it basically allows us to realize we're not God. I have a lot of medical doctor friends of mine, and you know, we're PhDs, so, you know, get at this whole doctor thing, and there's a lot of ribbing that goes on among doctors. And my favorite medical doctor joke is, you know the difference between God and a doctor? And they go, what? I said, God doesn't think he's a doctor. So the ego sometimes is so high in academics and also medical profession or whatever. I mean, there's a variety of those. And it's because of academics, and ego gets up there, and the ego. But when the ego takes over, then there's not a lot of confession. And with ego, you know, some people say, oh, they're just confident, and other people say, oh, he's arrogant. And those who are confident are often understood as arrogant, and some who are arrogant are often understood as confident. And maybe that's just a fine line.
Right.
But I think in worship, the arrogance is gone. The confidence is, I am a man of unclean lips. And all of a sudden, when I admit that, all of a sudden there is this possibility of more in my life. And with that possibility of more comes this concept of sacredness and worship. You know, we're at the top of the food chain when it comes to academics.
Yeah.
But I love to be honest with people. But when it comes to quietness and sunsets and the awe of life, none of us have reached the point to where there are no more awe. And if there is no more times where we're swept away, then we really need to take a deep step back.
That's well said, because it leads to the point that we talked about. Because again, we had these 3 points, and we kind of just brazed over them, and I really wanted to talk about those today. The first one you talked about is someone who is like unwilling to confess. Like why outside of ego? Like what's in our nature that when we get into worship and we're in the environment, especially at Suncoast, because it's so unique, the music is so enveloping. Like, what is it that prevents a person from saying to God, here's my hang-ups, my hurts, the habits I'm not proud of? Like, what's the obstacle?
Well, I think vulnerability is part of that. I am not ready. I'm just not ready to open myself up in that level of intimacy in a crowd. But sometimes when the inhibitions are gone, you and I both grew up in a place where, you know, you can hold your hands up and that whole thing. And there's something that happens, but it's hard to take an introvert and say, well, if you do this, then you're going to feel that way, because they may never.
That's right.
I mean, for them to feel like they've opened up, they've turned their hands from down to up.
Yeah.
And they feel like that's it, or maybe their fingers are open instead of fistculents. But at the end of the day, it's, is there more?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think there is. And we recognize that and realize that we can become more. And because of that possibility, I'm open to this gratitude and thanksgiving. I'm right back in the ancient times where you're stuck in a class. You're either in the farmer class or maybe you're in the merchant class, and once you're born into that class, you're there.
Yeah.
And you can never go any farther. But in this concept of before the divine, we're open ourselves up to realize there are no classes in the kingdom perspective, and God embraces us all where we are. And when I get caught up to say, you mean the sky's the limit? Oh, you got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
I'm not held back anymore.
Yeah.
No. And the more that I really want Christ to be in my life, or the Spirit of God, He already is, the more my eyes are open, and I begin to soar with this this concept of worship.
I love that idea of vulnerability. And you asked me a question again that I thought, man, we could have had an entire dialogue on the difference between priests and prophets. And I really wanted to get your take on it as opposed to just throwing it out there saying, here's like a definitional difference. But what do you think about what I said, that with priests, and we see this reflected in the modern evangelical culture, it was about tradition as a type of transaction. In other words, just believe this and you're good. Whereas the prophet was always the person who saw training as a mode of possible transformation. Like, you have to participate in your own transformation. So it's not about just believing this.
Right.
It's about becoming this. Like, why is so many churches so fixated on as long as you believe, but there's no responsibility to become?
Yeah. That's really interesting. Let me back up. My understanding of priest, I would, in modern day, I'd say priests are the academics. Yeah. And the prophets are the rogues. Yeah. The priests are the guys that have it all in their head. The prophets are the guy that has it in their heart. Ah. So I see one is, the scribes and Pharisees were the seminary professors, but the Pharisees were probably the church board members. But here comes a prophet. He has a different role altogether. He's basically speaking into both their lives, saying, yeah, you guys, and use the disparaging, you're eggheads from seminary, or you guys are just PhDs. I'm a guy that really is living this out. Yeah. Now, what I think is amazing, here comes Jesus, and he comes in, and he has such insights. Who was your rabbi? How did you learn such things? Such intellectual insights, but also this combination between that and the fire of life and helping the marginalized. Yeah. Just as Jesus brings us the whole person. Yeah. And sometimes we only live in part of our person. And, so does that make sense?
Absolutely.
I'm just trying to, that's where my thought is tracking. But I do think you are right that people say, oh, just believe. Yeah. And you go, believe what? Yeah. So at some point there has to be this mixture of honesty, some sort of intellect, yet some sort of life processes that have motivated us to be more than what we are, or challenge or hope comes in, and all of a sudden, I'm going to live this life that I'm called to live. And that's your job and mine, is how do we blend those together to where it's something that's meaningful to people and they feel inspired, and it's not just they're getting something that they from an academic realm, but they're also getting this practical application to that. Yeah. And that's the genius. When we do it well, we go, wow, we did it well. Yeah. And we don't do it well, man, we really, one of my favorite lines is from the guys that walked out of church one day. He said, well, you didn't suck too bad today. So sometimes that's about as good as it gets. Well, some days, we don't always hit a home run, but when we do, it feels good. And it's usually that blend of priest, prophet, and also the one who speaks into the world, the heart of God. Yeah. And that's our joy to do that. And it's also our challenge, and something we really work hard to make sure we do. I know you do.
Yeah, so. It's one of those things where, the way I view worship is it's not just obviously music, it's not just teaching, but it's like the envelopment of my whole being. Right. Like worship encompasses my intellect, my heart, and my volition. We say head, heart, hands sort of thing. And when that tri-cylinder part of who I am is acknowledging God, then I'm in this like complete state of worship, man. And that's when I get those senses of awe, and I get the sense of this heightened sense of awareness that God is present with me. And I used to do that as a youth pastor when kids would come to me, Troy, I don't feel I'm walking with God. And I'd say, head, heart, or hands. One of those are out of alignment.
Right.
Are you worshiping? Like, are you serving others? Are you thinking about your life in a way that includes God? And if one of those are out of line, then you throw the whole system off.
So let me ask you a question about we talked about the God bubble. Mm-hmm. Elaborate on that a little more for our listeners today.
Like the God bubble of
two bubbles versus one bubble.
Yeah, you put that into my brain in the first service where I'd never thought of it that way. That we have this concept of God being external. God is out there somewhere in heaven, and he can break into our space or invade our space at will, or if we pray hard enough. And what we've been taught is that our bubble and God's bubble become interfaced when I begin to do religious things.
Right.
Like if I pray more, if I give to the church more, these bubbles begin to overlap. And it's in that overlap where I can experience God. And I think it's BS. I think there's only one bubble, and that is the totality, the unity of what God is or who God is. And we're already in that bubble. And there's no religious thing that makes my bubble overlap with God.
Right.
It's my entire being, everything I do, from how I love my wife to how I communicate with my kids to how I interact with my colleagues at work to how I love people at Publix to how I treat people on the highway. There's nothing that exists in my bubble that isn't always already in God's.
Yeah, and I think throughout history and the ancient Hebrew concept, it was all about oneness.
Yeah.
Heart, soul, and strength were all one. And then you get a little bit later in history, and the Greek splits people up into body and spirit, and the body's bad, the spirit is all good.
Yeah.
And at some point, we start all these divisions.
Duality, yeah.
A duality. And we really want to talk about the opposite of duality. And I wish there was a better word for this, but unity, or this whole concept that it's not God versus me, but it is God in me, and we are one.
That's right.
Now, I'm not God, but God is in me totally.
Yeah.
And the more I realize that, the more I begin to see my understanding can be so much greater when I allow my heart to be blended with his vision for my life. And then I begin to worship, because all of a sudden the awe, the sacredness is always been there.
Yep.
I've just been too blind to see. So I began to pray the prayer, oh God, open my eyes, open not just my eyes, but open my heart to all that is around me, that's in me, and may I be totally enveloped by your presence. And as I do that, I begin to say, words of worship, words of I don't know how this works, but I'm so glad I'm not alone.
Yeah.
And it's this presence. And I think we go back in history and look at Jesus, the God-man.
Yeah.
He's the man that was born that all of a sudden he's fully understands this whole concept of unity with God. I'm in the Father, the Father's in me. We can't be separate.
Yeah.
We're totally. And someday you too will be sons of God. But you got to, you got to get your head in the right place and your heart in the same place to where you realize that God is your Father.
Yep.
And he'll always be with you. And I think that is a central message that we like to skip over that and go to some transactional thing.
Yep.
If you do this, then God will do that.
That's right.
Rather than this unifying thing. So I know we've gone along about this.
That's awesome. But I think if you do that, you begin to see God everywhere.
I agree.
That's what's powerful.
And I like to think that I do.
Yeah.
But in my humility, I go, oh, but are my eyes really fully open, or just am I looking through tightly shut? Maybe I'm just getting a glimpse, and I'm okay with a glimpse.
Yeah.
But I really want my eyes to be more. And as they are, my ego becomes less, and God becomes more about me. And that's just a goal we all strive for, to be more of God being seen through me. And I pray this prayer, oh God, bless me that I may bless others. Fill me that I may pour my life out in a greater fashion. I only need the resource so that I can give it away.
Yeah.
Not to hoard it. And I think that's the Spirit of Christ in all of us.
It's awesome. So one more week, we close out the worship series.
Yep.
And you're going to be talking about availability.
That's right.
I can't wait to hear it.
It's going to be fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Dr. Baucom.
Pleasure.